What if England's greatest queen died at age 10? In 1543, Princess Elizabeth vanished from Bisley during a plague outbreak that killed in hours. The girl who returned was never quite the same. By the end of this video, you'll discover the medical evidence that proves she couldn't have survived, and the shocking reason why no one could ever tell King Henry VIII the truth. July 1543, a 10-year-old red-haired girl collapses in a manor house 30 miles from London. Within 6 hours, she's dead. The household panics because this isn't just any child. This is Princess Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of King Henry VIII, the man who beheaded his own wives for disappointing him. Now imagine that same household making a decision so desperate, so dangerous, that if discovered, everyone involved would face execution by drawing and quartering. They replace the dead princess with a local boy who looks similar enough to pass. The girl who would become England's greatest monarch never actually existed. She died before her 11th birthday, and the person who ruled for 45 years was an impostor. This is the Bisley Boy legend, and while historians dismiss it as folklore, the medical evidence tells a different story. In 1543, a disease ravaged England that was so lethal, so rapid in its killing mechanism, that survival for a child Elizabeth's age was medically impossible. The sweating sickness didn't just make people ill, it triggered a cascade of organ failures that no human body, especially not a child's, could withstand. Court records from that summer show Elizabeth disappeared from all official documentation for nearly 3 months, an unusual gap for a royal child whose movements were typically meticulously recorded. When she reappeared at court in October 1543, multiple courtiers noted she seemed much changed and grown in confidence beyond her years. Odd observations for a girl who had supposedly been recovering from illness in the countryside. The historical context makes this conspiracy terrifyingly plausible. Elizabeth had been sent to Bisley, a small village in Gloucestershire, specifically because London was experiencing another outbreak of the sweating sickness in June 1543. Her household included Thomas Parry, her cofferer and estate manager, Catherine Chumpernowne, her governess, and a small retinue of servants, no more than 20 people total. This wasn't a grand royal household with hundreds of witnesses. It was a skeleton crew designed to keep the princess safe and out of sight. Henry VIII had a complicated relationship with Elizabeth. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, whom he'd executed for treason and adultery in 1536, when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. The king had declared Elizabeth illegitimate and removed her from the line of succession, yet he couldn't quite abandon her entirely. She lived in a strange limbo, still a princess by birth, but officially a bastard with no claim to the throne. This precarious position meant her household walked a tightrope. They had to care for her as befitted royalty, but they received minimal support from the crown. If something went catastrophically wrong, like the princess dying under their care, they couldn't count on royal protection. Thomas Parry in particular had everything to lose. He'd been appointed by Henry himself and was responsible for Elizabeth's financial affairs and safety. A dead princess on his watch meant more than just losing his position. It meant facing the king's legendary wrath. Historical records show Parry was a pragmatic man, not particularly brave or noble, but clever and survival-oriented. Faced with an impossible situation, would such a man choose honesty and certain death? Or would he gamble on a desperate fraud? The summer of 1543 wasn't just any summer. It was the 5th major outbreak of the English sweating sickness, and contemporary accounts describe it as particularly savage. John Caius, a Cambridge physician who would later write the definitive contemporary account, a boke or counsel against the disease commonly called the sweat, documented cases in East Anglia that same summer. His observations provide crucial medical evidence for what happened in Bisley. Caius described patients who were merry at dinner and dead at supper, a phrase that appears repeatedly in 16th century chronicles because it captured the disease's horrifying speed. The sweating sickness had a pattern. It struck hardest in summer months, killed the young and healthy more readily than the old and weak, and left no visible marks on the body. Victims often appeared entirely normal externally, even after death, which added to the terror. There was no way to see it coming, no warning signs, no protective measures that worked consistently. For a household trying to hide a royal death, this created both a problem and an opportunity. The lack of visible symptoms meant they couldn't claim Elizabeth died of something else like smallpox or plague, which left characteristic marks. But it also meant that if they could dispose of the body quickly and produce a living replacement, there would be no physical evidence to contradict their story. And here's where the timeline gets truly suspicious. What happened next in Bisley would change the course of English history. Let's talk about what the sweating sickness actually did to the human body, because understanding the biology makes Elizabeth's alleged death not just possible but probable. The disease had a documented pattern that physicians like John Caius observed repeatedly: sudden onset of extreme fever, often reaching temperatures that modern medicine would classify as hyperpyrexia, 105 to 107 degrees Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, proteins in human cells begin to denature, essentially cooking from the inside. The first symptom victims reported was an overwhelming sense of dread and apprehension, followed within an hour by violent headache and severe pain in the neck, shoulders, and limbs. Then came the sweating. Not ordinary perspiration, but a profuse, uncontrollable flood that soaked through multiple layers of clothing within minutes. Caius documented cases where patients lost so much fluid through their skin that their bedding had to be changed every hour. And even then, pools of sweat accumulated on the floor beneath their beds. This wasn't hyperbole or medieval exaggeration. These were clinical observations from a trained physician who had no reason to embellish. The sweating was the body's desperate attempt to cool itself, a last-ditch biological mechanism that paradoxically accelerated death. Modern medical analysis of these symptoms suggests the sweating sickness may have been a hantavirus, similar to the hemorrhagic fever viruses we see today, or possibly an influenza strain with unusual neurological components. The critical phase came between hours 3 and 6 after symptom onset. Patients entered what Caius called the crisis, a period where the body's regulatory systems simply collapsed. The extreme fever caused brain swelling, leading to delirium, seizures, and in many cases, coma. Simultaneously, the massive fluid loss through sweating triggered hypovolemic shock, where blood volume drops so dramatically that the heart can't pump enough blood to vital organs. In children, this process accelerates because their smaller bodies have less fluid volume to begin with, and their metabolic rates run higher, generating even more heat. A 10-year-old girl like Elizabeth would have had approximately 3.5 liters of total blood volume. Losing just 15 to 20% of that, roughly half a liter, would push her into shock. At the sweating rates Caius described, that threshold would be crossed within 2 to 3 hours. Once in shock, the cascade becomes irreversible without modern intervention. The kidneys, desperate to conserve fluid, shut down, leading to acute renal failure. The liver, stressed by the extreme temperature and struggling to process metabolic waste products, begins to fail. The heart, pumping blood that's becoming increasingly thick and sludgy from dehydration, develops arrhythmias. Brain cells, starved of oxygen and literally cooking at temperatures above 106 degrees, begin dying en masse. This is multi-organ failure, and in 1543 there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to stop it. No intravenous fluids existed to replace lost volume. No ice baths or cooling blankets could reduce the fever fast enough. No antibiotics could fight secondary infections. Here's the truly damning medical evidence. Children who contracted the sweating sickness had mortality rates approaching 90%, according to parish burial records from the 1543 outbreak. Adults had roughly a 50-50 chance if they survived the first 24 hours, but children almost never made it past hour 12. Caius specifically noted this phenomenon, writing that the young and lusty died fastest, while the elderly sometimes recovered. Modern epidemiologists studying these records believe this inverse age mortality pattern suggests a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the immune system where a healthy, robust immune response becomes the weapon that kills the host. Children and young adults with strong immune systems mounted such aggressive responses to the infection that they essentially killed themselves with inflammation. Elizabeth, at age 10, was precisely in the highest risk demographic. She was past early childhood diseases but hadn't yet reached puberty, meaning her immune system was at peak reactivity. If she contracted the sweating sickness, and being in Gloucestershire during the July 1543 outbreak meant exposure was highly likely, her chances of survival weren't just poor, they were virtually non-existent. And this is where the conspiracy becomes medically necessary rather than historically convenient. A household watching their royal charge die within hours, knowing they'll face execution for failing to protect her, suddenly has a powerful motivation to do the unthinkable. But could they actually pull it off? That depends entirely on timing, and the timeline of that summer reveals something disturbing. Distance and time, two factors that made deception possible in Tudor England. Bisley sits approximately 32 miles west of London, a journey that in 1543 would take a fast rider on a fresh horse roughly 4 to 5 hours in good conditions. But late July weather in England is unpredictable. Summer rains turn roads to mud, and no one rides fast horses through darkness on medieval roads. If Elizabeth fell ill at midday, by the time a messenger reached London, it would be evening. Even if the message went directly to the king, unlikely given court protocol, and even if Henry immediately dispatched the royal physicians back to Bisley, they wouldn't arrive until the following morning at earliest. By then, based on the sweating sickness timeline, Elizabeth would have been dead for 12 to 18 hours. This wasn't a situation where summoning help made sense. By the time help arrived, there would only be a corpse to examine. Thomas Parry would have understood this calculation immediately. He'd served in royal households long enough to know the protocols, the distances, the impossibility of the situation. Every hour he waited to send word to London was another hour for the household to process what had happened and consider alternatives. The historical record shows no emergency messenger was dispatched from Bisley to London in July 1543. No record exists of royal physicians being summoned. No documentation survives of any concern about Elizabeth's health during that summer. The silence in the archives is complete and suspicious. Consider Henry VIII's state of mind in summer 1543. He was 52 years old, morbidly obese, with a festering leg wound from an old jousting injury that never healed properly and leaked pus constantly. Modern medical historians believe he suffered from osteomyelitis, a bone infection that caused chronic pain and likely contributed to his increasingly erratic behavior. He'd already executed 2 wives, divorced 2 others, and widowed 1. He'd broken with the Catholic Church, dissolved the monasteries, and beheaded several close advisors, including Thomas Cromwell. He was a man who saw betrayal and incompetence everywhere, who trusted no one, and whose response to bad news was typically execution. His relationship with Elizabeth was complicated by grief and guilt. She reminded him of Anne Boleyn, the woman he'd loved passionately before destroying utterly. He'd declared Elizabeth illegitimate, but recent political pressures had forced him to restore both her and her half-sister Mary to the succession in the Third Succession Act of 1543, passed just 2 months before Elizabeth's alleged death in Bisley. Henry had finally grudgingly acknowledged Elizabeth as his daughter again after 7 years of official bastardry. Now imagine being Thomas Parry, having to ride to London and inform this paranoid, violent, grieving king that the daughter he just reinstated to the succession had died under Parry's care. The best possible outcome would be immediate execution. The more likely outcome would involve torture to extract confessions of negligence or even suspected murder, followed by execution of everyone in the household. But there's another timeline that matters: the communications blackout that summer. In Tudor times, royal children had their activities and health documented regularly through letters between household staff and the court. These weren't formal state documents, but routine correspondence. The governess writing to request more funds, the estate manager reporting on expenses, occasional letters from the princess herself practicing her handwriting and Latin. For Elizabeth, these letters exist regularly throughout 1542 and early 1543. Then there's a gap, a hole in the historical record from mid-July to early October 1543, where Elizabeth effectively vanishes from documentary evidence. When the correspondence resumes in October, Elizabeth's handwriting appears noticeably different. More confident with different letter formations, a detail that handwriting analysts examining the archives have noted but typically attribute to natural development. Yet handwriting analysis shows that specific muscle memory patterns established in childhood typically remain consistent. The shift in Elizabeth's script after summer 1543 isn't just maturation. It's a fundamental change in baseline characteristics. Could this simply be a 10-year-old's writing improving over a summer? Possibly. Or could it be evidence that a different hand was now writing letters signed Elizabeth? The medical evidence suggests that if the real Elizabeth contracted the sweating sickness, the answer becomes clear. But understanding why the conspiracy could work requires looking at who was available to replace her. And that's where the legend gets its most disturbing details. Here's what we know about Bisley in 1543. It was a small village, perhaps 200 people total, centered around wool production and farming. The local church of St. John the Baptist served the community, and Thomas Parry would have known the village intimately. He managed Elizabeth's household expenses, which meant dealing with local suppliers for food, cloth, and labor. In a village that small, Parry would have known virtually every family, including which households had children approximately Elizabeth's age and appearance. The legend specifically names the substitute as the son of a local family, though names have been lost or deliberately obscured over centuries. What matters is the biological possibility. Finding a 10-year-old child with red gold hair and pale skin in England wasn't particularly difficult. What was difficult was finding one who could be convincingly transformed into a princess. This is where the details get forensic. Elizabeth Tudor in 1543 had distinctive characteristics. She was small for her age, slender, with reddish blonde hair, pale skin, and the typical Tudor features including a high forehead and prominent nose. But she was also 10 years old, meaning her face hadn't yet settled into adult bone structure. A child's face is malleable, and two children of similar age and coloring can look remarkably alike at a distance, especially in 16th century conditions where artificial lighting was poor, and most people saw royalty only rarely and briefly. The selection process would have been brutal in its calculation. Parry needed a child who was physically similar but also socially vulnerable, someone whose disappearance wouldn't trigger immediate investigation. Parish records from Bisley show several child burials in summer 1543, but they are cataloged as sweating sickness deaths without specific names or dates. This vagueness was common during plague outbreaks, when record-keeping collapsed under the sheer volume of deaths. Within this chaos, a male child vanishing from his family to replace a dead princess would have been explained as another plague victim, and the family, if they even knew the truth, would have been powerless to object. Consider the social dynamics. A low-born family approached by a royal household officer and told their son has been chosen for service to the princess. They'd be honored, terrified, and completely unable to refuse. If the boy never came home, if they were told he'd died of sickness while in royal service, who would they complain to? Certainly not the king. The leverage was absolute. The boy himself would have been terrified, confused, and entirely dependent on the adults orchestrating the substitution. At age 10, children are cognitively sophisticated enough to learn complex behaviors, but also psychologically vulnerable to manipulation. With his survival dependent on successfully impersonating Elizabeth, and with months of isolation to practice before returning to court, a clever child could learn mannerisms, speech patterns, and behaviors well enough to fool courtiers who hadn't seen Elizabeth closely in months. The physical transformation would have been straightforward. Tudor children, especially nobility, wore similar clothing regardless of gender: long gowns, petticoats, and elaborate headwear that covered hair. The key difference was that boys wore doublets and hose once they were breeched around age 6 or 7. But in private settings, a boy dressed in girls' clothing would be indistinguishable. Elizabeth's body would have needed to be hidden quickly before decomposition set in. The summer heat of July accelerates putrefaction, and by 24 hours post-mortem, odor becomes unmistakable. If Elizabeth died in the manor house, her body couldn't remain there. The legend claims she was buried hastily in the manor gardens, and in 1879, during renovation work at what was believed to be Elizabeth's Bisley residence, workers allegedly discovered a stone coffin containing the skeleton of a child in Tudor-era clothing. The remains were supposedly reburied immediately without examination. A convenient detail that prevents verification, but aligns with Victorian-era practices where disturbing Christian burials was considered deeply inappropriate. Whether this discovery actually happened remains unverifiable, but the architectural evidence is clear. The site identified as Elizabeth's Bisley residence does have gardens old enough to date to the 16th century, and ground-penetrating radar surveys in the 1990s detected anomalies consistent with disturbed earth and stone structures buried at depths suggesting centuries of age. No one has been granted permission to excavate, so the question remains unanswered. But from a practical standpoint, burying Elizabeth secretly in the manor grounds solved multiple problems. It kept the body close enough for the household to monitor, it avoided transporting a corpse which would attract attention, and it meant no parish burial record that could later expose the truth. Now comes the training period, the window between death and discovery where the substitute had to become Elizabeth Tudor. Historical records show Elizabeth didn't return to court until October 1543, giving the household roughly 3 months of isolation to transform a village boy into a convincing princess. This wasn't just about physical appearance, it was about mastering an entire identity. Elizabeth Tudor at age 10 was already remarkably educated. She could read and write English and Latin, had begun studying Greek, and was known for her sharp intellect and quick wit. She had specific speech patterns, favorite phrases, and known preferences in food, activities, and study. The substitute would need to learn all of this or find ways to explain away discrepancies. Here's where the sweating sickness provided cover again. The disease was known to cause lasting effects in survivors, including memory problems, personality changes, and weakness. If Elizabeth returned to court claiming imperfect memory of the summer or showing different preferences, it could be attributed to her recovery from near-fatal illness. Catherine Champernowne, Elizabeth's governess and later known as Cat Ashley, was crucial to this scheme's success. She'd been with Elizabeth since age 4 and knew the princess intimately. For the substitution to work, Cat would have to be complicit. Was she? The historical record shows Cat remained fiercely loyal to Elizabeth throughout her life, even enduring imprisonment and interrogation rather than betray her. Such loyalty to a royal charge wasn't unusual, but Cat's protection of Elizabeth went beyond normal duty. The education problem could be managed with time. 3 months is sufficient for an intelligent 10-year-old to master basic Latin phrases, especially if the child already had some education. Village boys who were destined for clergy often learned basic Latin at grammar schools. The substitute wouldn't need perfect fluency immediately. He'd only need enough to avoid suspicion in casual conversation. As Elizabeth matured, any gaps in knowledge could be filled through intensive tutoring, which the real Elizabeth would have received anyway. In fact, the historical record shows that Elizabeth's education intensified dramatically after 1543, when she acquired new tutors including William Grindal and later Roger Ascham, both Cambridge scholars who brought rigorous classical training. Under their instruction, Elizabeth became one of the most learned monarchs in European history, fluent in 6 languages and capable of translating complex classical texts. But here's the interesting detail. Both Grindal and Ascham commented in their writings that Elizabeth seemed to learn with unusual quickness, as though making up for lost time. Ascham wrote that she studied with an earnest appetite, unusual in her youth, a phrase that could suggest either natural brilliance or desperate compensation. The substitute would also need to master Elizabeth's relationships with her half-siblings, Mary and Edward. Fortunately, these relationships were distant by necessity. Mary, 17 years older, had her own household and rarely saw Elizabeth. Edward, 6 years old in 1543, was being raised separately as the male heir. Neither would have noticed subtle differences in their half-sister's behavior after a 3-month absence. The return to court in October 1543 was the moment of maximum danger. This was when the substitution would either succeed or fail catastrophically. The historical record shows that Elizabeth returned quietly without ceremony and was initially kept at Hatfield House rather than brought immediately into the king's presence. This gradual reintroduction makes strategic sense. It allowed the household to control who had access to Elizabeth and observe reactions carefully. When she did appear before Henry several weeks later, the meeting was brief and formal. Court chronicles note that the king remarked on how much Elizabeth had grown and improved during her time in the country, a comment that reads differently through the lens of the substitution theory. Was Henry simply noting normal child development, or was he unconsciously registering that something about his daughter had fundamentally changed? We'll never know. But what we do know is that from October 1543 forward, Elizabeth Tudor lived under constant scrutiny, yet never was exposed. She survived her father's death in 1547, her brother's brief reign and death in 1553, her sister Mary's attempts to execute her for treason during the 1550s, and eventually ascended to the throne in 1558. For 45 years she ruled England, never marrying, never producing an heir, and jealously guarding her privacy with a paranoia that contemporary observers found excessive. And throughout it all, the questions persisted. Questions that wouldn't go away because they were rooted in observable facts that defied easy explanation. Let's examine the evidence that convinced conspiracy theorists that Elizabeth was actually male. First, her absolute, unwavering refusal to marry despite enormous political and religious pressure. In the 16th century, marriage wasn't optional for monarchs. It was a fundamental duty required to produce heirs and secure succession. Elizabeth was pressured to marry from the moment she became queen at age 25. Parliament petitioned her repeatedly. Her counselors arranged diplomatic marriages with Spanish princes, French dukes, and German nobles. English noblemen courted her favor, hoping for royal marriage. And Elizabeth deflected, delayed, and ultimately rejected them all. Her most famous declaration came in 1559. "I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband, namely the Kingdom of England." Romantic historians interpret this as Elizabeth prioritizing duty over personal happiness. But there's another interpretation. A biological male impersonating a queen couldn't risk a marriage that would require consummation and inevitably reveal the truth. The same logic applies to childbirth. Elizabeth needed an heir desperately. The entire kingdom knew that dying without children would trigger succession crises. Yet she never seriously pursued motherhood. When pressed, she gave vague assurances about marriage in good time, but never acted. As she aged and the window for childbearing closed, her excuses shifted to medical grounds. She claimed her health wouldn't permit pregnancy, though she remained vigorous and active into her 60s. Her physical appearance and comportment became increasingly masculine as she aged. Contemporary portraits show a progression from the soft-featured young woman in early portraits to the harsh, almost angular face of later images. Some of this is normal aging, but courtiers noted specific masculine characteristics. A prominent Adam's apple that required high collars to conceal, large hands with thick fingers unusual for a woman, a deep voice that grew deeper with age, and broad shoulders that required careful tailoring. Her body shape avoided the typical feminine curves. She was described as straight and narrow without breasts prominent enough to require supportive undergarments. When she died, the ladies who prepared her body for burial reportedly expressed shock at certain anatomical anomalies, though their accounts were suppressed and survive only as rumors in later documents. Elizabeth's movements were also noted as unusual for a woman of her era. She had a long masculine stride and refused to ride side saddle, preferring to ride horses astride like a man, a scandalous choice that she insisted upon despite protests about propriety. Her handwriting, too, showed masculine characteristics according to graphologists who have studied her letters. She used bold, aggressive strokes with heavy pressure, and her signature became increasingly elaborate and angular over time, suggesting psychological compensation, literally writing larger and more forcefully to claim authority. Her obsession with controlling her image reached pathological levels. In 1563, Elizabeth issued a royal proclamation forbidding any portraits of her to be created without official approval. She commissioned specific court painters and rejected dozens of portraits she deemed insufficiently flattering. As she aged, this control intensified. The famous Mask of Youth portraits from her later years show an eternally young queen with impossibly smooth skin and idealized features that bore little resemblance to eyewitness descriptions of the aging Elizabeth. She wore increasingly elaborate wigs, thick white makeup, and ornate clothing designed to obscure her body shape. When she died at age 69 in 1603, her face was reportedly caked with nearly an inch of white lead makeup, and removing it revealed a face so different from her public image that courtiers were shocked. This extreme vanity is often attributed to normal female concern with beauty and aging, but it could also reflect desperate efforts to prevent scrutiny of masculine features that might reveal the truth. Elizabeth's personal chambers were famously off-limits except to a tiny circle of trusted ladies-in-waiting, and even they were forbidden from discussing what they observed. Execution was the penalty for gossiping about the queen's body or personal habits. Such draconian enforcement of privacy goes beyond normal royal protocol. It suggests active suppression of dangerous information. And then there's the matter of the missing Bisley parish records, which brings us to the most tangible evidence, or rather, its suspicious absence. Parish records in England were the backbone of civil registration in Tudor times. Baptisms, marriages, and burials were documented in church registers that survive to this day for most parishes. Bisley's records should include entries for 1543, but they don't. There's a gap in the register precisely covering the months of Elizabeth's supposed stay and death. This gap could be innocent. Records were sometimes lost to fire, flood, or simple neglect. But the selective nature of this gap, appearing exactly when and where it would be most relevant to the conspiracy, raises questions. In 1873, a vicar named Thomas Keble, who served at Bisley, claimed to have seen older records that referenced a royal child buried in the manor grounds. But these records allegedly disappeared before they could be independently verified. Keble's account appeared in the Monthly Chronicle of North Country Lore and Legend and was dismissed as local folklore. But Keble was a respected clergyman with no obvious motive to fabricate. Then there's the 1879 discovery of the stone coffin containing child remains in Tudor clothing. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the Gloucester Journal reported the find, describing how workers at Overcourt Manor, identified as Elizabeth's residence, unearthed a stone box containing the skeleton of a female child in ancient dress. The remains were examined briefly by the estate owner, who noted the clothing appeared to date from the mid-16th century, and the coffin's stone construction suggested importance, as ordinary children were buried in wooden coffins or simple shrouds. The skeleton was reburied without forensic examination, a decision that seems criminally negligent by modern standards, but was typical of Victorian attitudes toward historical remains. The conspiracy's longevity required silence from dozens of people over decades. How could such a secret hold? The answer lies in the brutal realities of Tudor England and the psychology of complicity. First, understand that the initial conspiracy involved very few people, perhaps 10 to 15 individuals at most. Thomas Parry, Cat Ashley, a handful of household servants who witnessed the death and substitution, and possibly a few locals in Bisley who provided the substitute child and handled Elizabeth's burial. Each of these people had overwhelming reasons to remain silent. For the household staff, speaking out meant confessing to treason, with execution as the guaranteed consequence. They'd also implicate their families. Tudor justice often extended to relatives of traitors. The psychological dynamic here is crucial. They'd already committed the crime. Once Elizabeth was buried and the substitute presented as the real princess, everyone involved was equally guilty. There was no walking back, no redemption through confession. Silence became survival. As years passed and the conspiracy succeeded, silence became investment protection. Each year Elizabeth lived and prospered as a Tudor princess. Later as queen was another year validating their choice. Confession would destroy not just themselves, but the entire regime. This created a shared bond of mutual assured destruction. If one person talked, everyone burned. Such arrangements are remarkably stable because the costs of defection are catastrophic for everyone involved. For the substitute himself, the psychological mechanisms are more complex. A 10-year-old boy thrust into this situation would initially be terrified and confused, likely clinging to adult authority figures for guidance. But children are also remarkably adaptable. Over time, the role of Elizabeth would become the substitute's actual identity. Modern psychology recognizes that identity formation in childhood is malleable. Children who experience dramatic role changes can integrate those changes into their core sense of self. The substitute wouldn't think of himself as a boy impersonating a princess. He would become Elizabeth Tudor in every meaningful psychological sense. This explains one of the most puzzling aspects of Elizabeth's later life: her apparent genuine belief in her royal identity and divine right to rule. She showed no signs of impostor syndrome, no crisis of confidence about her legitimacy. If she'd been consciously maintaining a fraud for decades, some stress or inconsistency would likely have emerged. Instead, she ruled with absolute conviction in her right to the throne. This makes sense if the substitute had fully internalized the Elizabeth identity during childhood. By adulthood, there would be no separation between actor and role. She was Elizabeth, and the boy from Bisley had ceased to exist, even in her own mind. This psychological transformation is actually well documented in cases of extreme childhood trauma where children create alternate identities as coping mechanisms. The substitute would have undergone similar psychological processes, reinforced by constant external validation, as everyone around him treated him as Elizabeth. External factors also ensured silence. Henry VIII died in 1547, just 4 years after the alleged substitution. With him gone, the primary threat, the paranoid king who'd have executed everyone involved, was neutralized. Edward VI, his 9-year-old son, was controlled by regents who had no reason to investigate Elizabeth's authenticity and every reason to maintain stability. Mary I, who succeeded Edward in 1553, despised Elizabeth and tried to have her executed for treason, but on political grounds related to Protestant rebellion, not suspicions of imposture. Mary interrogated Elizabeth brutally during the Wyatt Rebellion of 1554, using methods that would have broken most people but found nothing to justify execution. If Elizabeth had been hiding a fundamental secret, that would have been the moment of maximum vulnerability. Yet she survived. This suggests either the secret was so well hidden that even torture and intensive investigation couldn't uncover it, or that everyone who knew was already dead. By the time Elizabeth became queen in 1558, the original conspirators were dying of natural causes. Thomas Parry lived until 1560, Cat Ashley until 1565. As they died, they took the secret with them, if it existed. The next generation of courtiers and servants knew only the official story. Without first-hand witnesses, the truth became impossible to verify or disprove. It transformed from conspiracy to legend, safely insulated from investigation by the barrier of death. So, what's the truth? The medical evidence is unambiguous. If Princess Elizabeth Tudor contracted the sweating sickness in Bisley in July 1543, Her survival was medically near impossible given her age, the disease's documented lethality in children, and the complete absence of effective treatments. The historical evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The gap in her documentary record that summer, the reports of change in her appearance and demeanor, the missing parish records, the alleged discovery of child remains, and the circumstantial details all align with the conspiracy theory, but none constitute proof. The circumstantial evidence from her later life is intriguing. Her refusal to marry or bear children despite overwhelming pressure and practical necessity, her physical characteristics that contemporaries noted as unusual, her extreme control over her image, and her paranoid protection of privacy all fit the pattern. We'd expect if she were hiding a fundamental secret about her identity. But they also fit other explanations: trauma from her childhood, political calculation about maintaining independence, or simple personality quirks amplified by power. The psychological evidence is perhaps most compelling. The conspiracy theory explains behaviors that otherwise seem irrational or self-destructive. Why would England's queen, desperate for an heir, refuse all suitors and die childless, ending the Tudor dynasty? The conventional answer is that she valued power over personal happiness and feared marriage would diminish her authority. But that assumes Elizabeth was willing to sacrifice England's future stability for her own autonomy, a decision that seems remarkably selfish for a monarch who otherwise showed deep commitment to her kingdom's welfare. If the Bisley Boy legend is true, then Elizabeth's decisions make different sense. She couldn't marry because intimacy would expose the fraud. She couldn't bear children because she was biologically male. Her paranoid control over her body and image wasn't vanity but necessity. One close examination would destroy everything. Her fierce defense of her legitimacy as Henry's daughter wasn't just political strategy, but psychological survival. Questioning her identity threatened the core of her sense of self. And her ultimate decision to name James VI of Scotland as her heir, rather than leaving England in chaos, shows that despite the fraud, she genuinely cared about the kingdom's future. She'd lived as Elizabeth for 60 years. In every meaningful sense, she had become her. The real Elizabeth died in Bisley in 1543, her body destroyed by a disease that medical science couldn't combat, killed by an immune system that turned against itself, betrayed by biology. The girl who became Elizabeth I was born male in some nameless cottage in Gloucestershire, thrust into an impossible situation at age 10, and forced to live an extraordinary lie that shaped history. Or perhaps the whole story is legend, Tudor-era folklore given medical plausibility by the very real horror of the sweating sickness, and Elizabeth Tudor simply had the extraordinarily good fortune to survive an unsurvivable disease and grow into greatness. We'll never know for certain. The truth died with the last person who witnessed what happened in that manor house in July 1543. But the medical evidence remains. If she caught the sweating sickness, she should have died. That she didn't is either a medical miracle or evidence of the most successful deception in English history. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. Drop a comment with your theory. Do you think Elizabeth survived or was she replaced? And hit that like button because the more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will recommend it to other history enthusiasts who need to see this evidence. The truth of what happened in Bisley deserves to be examined, and every subscription helps us uncover more hidden secrets from the past.